The year ahead through the prism of a huge global survey of voters and decision makers, and hear about why the government's worried about Elon Musk's AI machine Grok, while a minister and surgeon explains the priorities of the new online NHS operation on its way to patients in England. Wild times, wise voices. Join me after the news.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock, European leaders, including Sir Keir Starmer, have issued a warning to Donald Trump about Greenland, saying the island belongs to its people. It's after the US president renewed threats to annex the territory from Denmark. Former Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff, Major General Jonathan Shaw, has told LBC the Prime Minister needs to take this very seriously.
This is going to demand a complete rejig of the psychology of the United Kingdom. The population of the UK needs to recognise the threat we're under, and we need to start shifting resources towards our defence and security in a way that we haven't done since the Cold War, if not before that.
30 leaders are meeting in Paris to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire in its conflict with Russia. The conversation is also likely to turn to Donald Trump's military action in Venezuela after capturing the country's president, Nicolas Maduro. South Yorkshire Police has referred itself to the watchdog after wrongly telling the family of a teenager he died. 17-year-old Thomas Wynne was actually under sedation in hospital after a car crash in Rotherham. And large parts of England and Wales face heavy snow this week, brought by high winds in Storm Goretti. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 118 points at 10,122. The pound buys $1.34 and €1.15. LBC weather: snow will linger in northern Scotland tonight, rain moving west across Wales and England with showers for Northern Ireland, lows of -3 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Sometimes a guest on this show will drop a truth bomb so big it almost shuts me up. Last night, Jeremy Hunt, the former Conservative Foreign Secretary, said that if Donald Trump tried to seize Greenland, that could be the end of NATO. Since then, I haven't been able to get what he said out of my head. Not least because the Danes, whose sovereign territory Greenland is, are now saying much the same thing. I think tonight we should start by looking coldly, without hysteria, but without illusion, at this possibility. 1. Are the Americans serious? Well, here is Stephen Miller, Trump's Homeland Security boss, speaking to CNN overnight.
It has been the formal position of the U.S. government since the beginning of this administration, frankly, going back into the previous Trump administration, that Greenland should be part of the United States. The president has been very clear about that. That is the formal position of the U.S. government.
Right, but can you say that military action against Greenland is off the table?
It wouldn't be military action against Greenland. The United States is the power of NATO. For the United States to secure the Arctic region, to protect and defend NATO and NATO interests, obviously Greenland should be part of the United States.
Clear enough? 2. With European leaders gathered in Paris today, it's clear that on this, Europe wants to hang together. But without NATO, without America, Ukraine will lose her war, and Western Europe is veering on defenseless against Putin's Russia. It's not just the US nuclear arsenal, but US intelligence, spies in the sky, logistics. Snapping NATO in two would be a bad guy's masterstroke, which gives the future to Vladimir Putin. Presumably the White House understands all of this, which is why Donald Trump feels he can be as aggressive as he is being. In the end, the wet Europeans will have to fall into line. But does American business, do American voters really want the chaos and collapse in Europe for the sake of making Greenland American? I'd prefer to believe that Trump, the deal maker, is trying to destabilize Denmark and the rest of us before striking the agreement he really wants for a huge expansion of US mineral and military activity in Greenland. I'd like to believe that, because it makes more sense. and it's a much less dangerous start to 2026. But do I believe it? Or is the simple colouring book prize of a huge American flag stretching far beyond the Arctic Circle what he wants more than anything, and to hell with the risks? For me, that is the question of the evening. And if you're asking yourself, why is he banging on about this so much? Let me remind you once more of Jeremy Hunt last night.
Annexing country that belongs to another NATO member is crossing an enormous red line. That would be incredibly difficult for Europe to swallow. And if I have a worry, Andrew, it is that the rather supine reaction we tend to get from European leaders when Donald Trump does something outrageous might be encouraging him to think that Greenland is something that he could get away with. I think that it really could spell the end of NATO, and I think that would be absolutely disastrous.
Indeed, and later on you're going to hear from someone who's at the heart of Donald Trump's national security operation in his first presidency, Victoria Coates. But before that, let's go to one of the most experienced international broadcasters there is, Christiane Amanpour, the chief international anchor at CNN and host of the global podcast, The X-Files, with Jamie Rubin. Christiane, great to have you on the show today. Now, you are a political analyst and commentator. You're not a psychologist. But what do you think Donald Trump really means when he talks about taking Greenland? Do you think he's seriously thinking about some kind of military intervention?
Can I just say, Andrew, that everything you thought about Donald Trump is off the table now. Really, nobody can predict. People would be stupid to say what he might do one day or the next day. And I think this abduction, he likes the word kidnap when it was posed to him by a reporter of Maduro, shows it. Even the most seasoned, even the most cynical foreign policy strategists did not believe that Trump's, intervention in Venezuela would go that far as to seize the dictator there, despite what they think about him, that he's illegitimate and all the rest of it, and that he's a narco-terrorist, etc. They did not believe it, but now it's happened. And so essentially anything can happen. That's why I think what Jeremy Hunt said to you last night was vitally important. You've seen that the European leaders have now stood up. They have not criticized wholesale the Trump action in Venezuela, but they have issued a warning altogether about Greenland, which happens to be in their hemisphere and happens to be part of NATO, part of Denmark. And as you know, and as you just said, the Danish Prime Minister also said it would be the end of NATO. Not it might be, or it would be difficult for NATO. It would spell the end of NATO. So I think that there are two things here. One is the West has to stand up for what it believes in and secure its own hemisphere, if you like, or its own zone of influence and its own NATO, even though America is the toughest and the biggest part of it. And also, you cannot predict with any certainty anymore what Trump will do. And just to add to that, it's not just me saying that. It's Trump's own some of them, previous security officials like John Bolton, who is his national security advisor and is a long-term Republican and a neocon and, no namby-pamby. And he basically said after the seizure of Maduro that Trump does not have a foreign policy philosophy. It's one thing one day and one thing the next day. So we just do not know is a simple answer.
Sure. And of course, John Bolton's a big Trump critic these days as well.
Yeah.
I take what you say about not being able to second guess Donald Trump these days very much to heart. Nonetheless, I guess one of the dangers for the Western European members of NATO now is that Trump understands how much they need American support, how much they need American military power, and guesses that in the end they will put pressure on Denmark to give Trump whatever he wants rather than break that alliance.
We'll see. I mean, this is the make or break for Europe, frankly. And to be fair, Trump has over the last year, he has basically made it clear that he's practically severing the strings between the United States and Europe. He says certain nice things about NATO, but then in his national security strategy, which we saw just, last month, it was, Europe faces civilizational erasure. It was cozying up to the idea of Russia and that kind of big power, big strength politics. Stephen Miller, who is Trump's deputy essential most senior political advisor inside the White House and has the whole immigration brief, has apparently now got every other brief. And, he said the Venezuela action showed that, yeah, it might be nice. And I'm quoting him, the niceties of international rules and regulation and the UN and, decades, 80 years of the American rule-based order may be all nice, in his word, but Trump has proved that we live in, quote unquote, the real world in which strength and power and all the other big words that they like to use actually dominate. So, who knows? Who knows what's going to happen next?
Well, I'm beginning to ask myself whether the whole post-Second World War international order, all that, panoply of rules and judges and the rest of it, is now looking like a mirage. And we're actually living in a world of at least three big competing empires, Russia, China, and America, and we better get used to it.
I mean, yes, but even that doesn't make any sense, because if Donald Trump has identified, and a lot of his people have identified China, and frankly, previous administrations have, as the big competitor for the, global dominance. Well, then what's he doing in Venezuela, not addressing China, which has a very deep foothold in Venezuela and in many other parts of Latin America, not Central America, but Latin America, South America, China is very deep in there, and nobody said anything about China, though, so it's unclear what Trump wants.
And Christiane, just one final question about Venezuela itself, and indeed about Colombia on the border, where we're hearing menacing noises from Trump as well. How big a problem do you think that could be? How deep a quagmire could that be for Trump?
Well, look, he has done a very successful, thanks to the CIA and the U.S. military, they've done a successful military operation. They have no plan B. They have no boots on the ground. They have no plan for, quote unquote, nation building that they say they want to do. Today, he said, or overnight, he said, that there would be no elections for a democratic transition until the U.S., quote, I think he said, heals Venezuela and lets it get back on its feet. Now, that isn't something you do by remote from Washington or from Mar-a-Lago. That's something that really takes a huge amount of policy, of advisors, of people on the ground as well. And there's no planning for that whatsoever, not to mention America's pretty dismal record on nation building ever since 9/11, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, the whole lot. You get rid of strongmen, and then you don't have a plan B. And then the reaction and the result is worse. And by the way, it's going to be very bad, this, for Ukraine as well. I know you're going to talk about the Ukraine thing in Europe, but there are no U.S. guarantees. And even if Ukraine says that they have a guarantee from Trump, they cannot trust it or believe it, according to many allies and analysts.
Wouldn't life be easier and safer if great nations learned from their past mistakes? Christiane Amanpour, thank you very, very much indeed for talking to LBC. Now then, as promised, somebody who knows Donald Trump well and fought alongside him in many political battles. Victoria Coates was his Deputy National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration, and she is Vice President of the Conservative Heritage Foundation in Washington. Welcome to the show, Victoria. Great to have you with us again. Can I start by asking whether you think, quite seriously, Donald Trump intends or would be prepared to invade Greenland?
Well, Andrew, good to see you. Happy 2026.
And to you.
Thank you. Now, I think the Greenland issue is a strategic one for President Trump. I think it is an issue along with Panama, specifically in the Western Hemisphere, that has really captured his attention given the vulnerability to the Arctic. And I don't think this is a situation that would require military intervention. I've seen some interesting movement today. For example, the Prime Minister of Denmark's office put out a fairly measured statement in conjunction with Italy, France, Finland, some other NATO allies, saying that this is something that needs to be done in discussion with the United States, decided by Denmark and Greenland. I think that's pretty reasonable. We've been talking about the freedom of association agreements we have with the islands in the Pacific, which are very beneficial to both parties, and that could take a burden off of Greenland. So I think there's a lot of possibilities there. I think what you're hearing from the president is his urgency on the issue.
So you could see a situation where, in a sense, there was a deal done, where the American military, perhaps American mineral companies, went into Greenland in a way they're not there at the moment. But do you think that could be done without Greenland actually, quotes, becoming part of the United States, quotes?
Oh, yes. And that's what these FAA agreements provide for us with Micronesia, for example, the Marshall Islands, is they actually have a degree of political participation in the U.S. system. They get a lot of assistance from the United States. And in return, we have things like we have military oversight. So say a Chinese warship can't dock there unless we say it's okay, and we generally don't. So that kind of exchange could be both really good for Greenland security, get the Russians and the Chinese out, but then also provide for the citizens of Greenland.
So you think, in essence, influence, an important grip on Greenland, but without American sovereignty, might be enough for the administration?
There are degrees of this, yes. So I think that is the kind of agreement that should be pursued. And if certainly President Trump has demonstrated anything over the last 75 years, it's that he prefers to make deals than to make war.
And if it was the case that a deal could be struck with the European members of NATO over Greenland, do you think that would help him be more positive about helping Ukraine, which is obviously the thing that concerns European nations more than any other?
Well, and I think that's actually a really key point. If the United States is doing more for Greenland, and it's very much in our sphere, then Denmark can do more for Ukraine and won't have that burden on their resources. And so I very much see this as part of the transatlantic security arrangement where Europe is doing more in Europe. And I think you're also hearing from the administration they aren't as interested in European intervention in the Pacific as we were in the first Trump term. Like, that's something we're going to have to deal with Australia and Japan, et cetera. We need Europe to be focused on Europe and take that primary burden for Ukraine.
So in a sense, we're back to spheres of influence, which might have been something earlier in the 20th century, rather than the kind of international order post-1945, the United Nations and all the rest of it.
This is definitely a different world order. I agree with that. And where we were 80 years ago is not where we are now. I mean, none of the institutions that were built up after the war had a China focus, for example, and China's now much more important to us than the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. So that is a different world. And the United States has to look at all quadrants. Because we have a new focus on the Western Hemisphere doesn't mean we don't care about Europe, that we wouldn't continue to provide leadership, nuclear umbrella, troops on the ground, all of those things. But we need Europe to also be doing more there because of Western Hem, because of Indo-Pacific, because of the Middle East.
Just cutting to the chase, if I may, is the proposal that you believe is the real one, that if Western European NATO members don't allow America to do what it wants to do in Greenland, then NATO is indeed under threat? Now, you know perfectly well that that is the most terrifying thing for Western Europe. They rely on NATO completely, and therefore, is it a fairly brutal bargain in the end? If you want NATO, you let us do what we want in Greenland.
Well, and I don't know that I would call it a brutal bargain. What I would say is what happened in The Hague in April, the pledges made by the major economies of Europe to get to 5% of defense spending, that's what saves Europe, ultimately. We want a strong Europe. We want a Europe taking a lead on Europe's defenses for all the reasons that we've been discussing. And, if that, in the end, that is what happens and we are able to incorporate a strategic asset in Greenland, I think that's a win-win.
Let me ask you about another part of the world for obvious reasons. After what happened to Maduro, clearly there have been menacing noises made by the administration about, for instance, Colombia and to a lesser extent Mexico. Do you think that this is part of a wider turn of policy against some of the regimes that President Trump regards as unfriendly, drug-running, narco-terrorists and the rest of it across South America?
I think you really put your finger on it. His focus is on the security of the American people, and the narco-terrorists, the people who are trafficking both drugs and human beings into our country, are the primary national security interests that we have here. And they have tried for a year to persuade Maduro. Venezuela is the key bad actor here, to persuade him to take a different path. He's been offered deals of various sorts. He refused, and ultimately this was the decision that was made. Colombia is a different case. There there are going to be elections in Colombia in May. Petro can't run for another term. So there will be change in Colombia in the first 6 months of this year. We don't necessarily have to implement that change. And the other thing is we have much older historic military to military relationships with Colombia, which do endure. Mexico, final problem, is even more difficult for us because it is on our border. So that is the most immediate threat. The cartels there are a huge problem. The president is trying to work with President Sheinbaum. I mean, I was surprised by the strength of their relationship. So they are making an effort. I just wish she would ask for more U.S. support against the cartels.
Well, Victoria, I thought this was going to be an interesting conversation, and so it has proved. Thank you so much for that. Now, coming up, we're going to get the reaction to that interview from a former security minister. But the time now, 6:20.
This is LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:22. Now, one of the side effects of the Venezuela adventure is that we haven't been paying nearly enough attention to what may turn out to be a bigger story still, which is the widespread and deadly insurrection going on in Iran right now. Tom Tugendhat, the Conservative MP and former Security Minister, has been gripped by that, and he joins me now. And Tom, I'm going to come to Iran, but before we do, I'd love to hear your reflection on what Victoria Coates has just said about there being a deal to be done over Greenland. Effectively, let the Americans in and you can keep NATO.
Well, it's slightly odd because there already is a deal. In fact, there are two deals. There's the 1941 agreement between the Kingdom of Denmark when it was the government in exile and the United States, which allowed the complete basing of any US personnel as the United States government saw fit for the defense of the United States. And that was, of course, facing Germany. And then, of course, there's the second deal, the 1949 deal, which effectively brought that up to speed and basically said the Americans can put as many troops as they like anywhere they like, so long as they ask the Kingdom of Denmark first. So I'm not quite sure what deal they're looking for, because under the existing treaties, the Americans could put as many troops as they like. They used to have 300,000 troops. They withdrew it down to 3,000. That was their choice, nobody else's.
Nobody else's. The implication of that, of course, is that Donald Trump means what he says, which is he wants it to be American. He wants it to be part of the United States.
Well, if he did want it to be, then he's got a relatively easy way of doing it, which is he should engage in a conversation with the Greenlanders, probably offer them a significant amount of money. I don't know how much they'd want, and offer them protectorate or some sort of territorial status or maybe even statehood. But that doesn't seem to be how it's going about. So I think at the moment what we're seeing is quite a lot of signaling to the US base, if I'm honest, rather more than genuine regime change, if you like, in Greenland. So let's wait and see. It
doesn't sound to me as if you think, as Jeremy Hunt told me yesterday, that this could break apart NATO.
Well, I mean, I very much hope not. And I'm very, very cautious about the way some people are ramping this up to say that it's a NATO defining factor. I mean, the purpose of NATO has always been, to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in, as Ismay put it in the 1940s. If we're going to fracture over this, that would be extremely pleasing to Beijing and Moscow, and extremely worrying to many people in Europe and Canada and the United States. So I think the job of our political leaders now is not to make this more fractious, but to find ways of resolving it. And I think that's where, yes, of course, there's things that the American government has been doing that are deeply unhelpful. But I think what we need to be doing is reminding the Americans that they're under their own existing treaties. They can base anything they like, anywhere they like, on Greenland already. And why don't they just do what they're allowed to do?
It's a very fair point. We both know we are in uncharted waters when it comes to President Trump's current behaviour. You mentioned Russia just now. We have the alarming-looking situation of a rogue oil tanker, part of the sort of dark fleet of rogue oil tankers, making its way across the Atlantic, not very far away from Britain now. And it looks as if the Americans want to board it. Meanwhile, the ship itself has declared itself to be Russian. That's the kind of flashpoint that could be extremely dangerous, isn't it?
Well, it shouldn't be. I mean, again, we're going through this bizarre charade of, our country and a few others sort of screaming international law when it harms us on things like Chagos Islands or whatever it happens to be, but refusing to use international law in areas where it is specifically geared to work. So the UN Law of the Sea, which governs the free movement of ships in the high seas, so not in territorial waters, says that coastal states, the UK is one, are allowed to intercept vessels and indeed call them into port and detain them if they pose an environmental or other threat to our coastal waters. And there is absolutely no question that these uninsured, unregulated, so-called shadow fleet carrying crude or trying to get to Russia in order to pick up crude are doing exactly that. So please, can we use international law when it helps us, not just when it hurts us? And sadly, that's not the way we're seeing our government, or indeed many others, doing it.
Tom, when we started, I said that I thought that what's going on in Iran could yet prove to be a bigger story than any of this. And I've noticed you've been posting on social media about it. Just your reflections. Donald Trump did say that if the regime in Iran carried on killing protesters, he would intervene. They have carried on killing protesters, but perhaps his attention is currently elsewhere.
Well, I'm not sure you're right, actually, Andrew. He has intervened. He's intervened by removing their head of state of the country that was doing all the financial transfers and quite a lot of the weapons building for the Islamic Republic. And I refer, of course, to Venezuela. The bit that we're missing in this Venezuela story is Venezuela is an integral part of the Islamic regime's ability to coordinate terrorist groups like Hezbollah, or to build ballistic missiles, or to build drones.
Sorry, Tom, I'm so sorry. Just explain to me why that's the case.
So, as you may be aware, the Islamic regime in Iran has always had a problem with sanctions ever since the 1979 revolution. In fact, particularly since Operation Eagle Claw, when the Americans tried and failed to rescue those hostages in the US embassy. I think it was about 100 hostages. Forgive me, I'm going to get the number wrong. And the Americans imposed sanctions on Iran at the time, financial sanctions, and then other sanctions have grown up. Well, one of the ways that the Iranian government has got round those sanctions, or tried to get round those sanctions anyway, is by using shadow banking facilities through countries like Venezuela. Now, over the years, many of the others have dropped away. Syria, for example, has dropped away. Countries in the Middle East have stopped cooperating. But one country that continued to cooperate right up until the 3rd of January, and probably is still cooperating a bit even now, is Venezuela. So what we've seen out of Venezuela is we've seen drugs carried by Hezbollah taken across into Liberia, Sierra Leone, and then up into Europe as a way of making money. We've seen weapons parts designed in Iran, built in Venezuela, then smuggled through some of this shadow fleet back into Iran, assembled into ballistic missiles, sent over into Russia, fired over to kill Ukrainians, and indeed some of them have crossed the border into Poland. So we're seeing actually already action against the Iranian regime. We just don't recognize it, because Venezuela is a key player in the Iranian regime's government of terror and global network.
Well, I always say that if you turn on to this programme, you learn something new. And I also learned something new tonight. Thank you very much indeed, Tom Tugendhat, for that. Fascinating. Now then, up next, we've heard that many European leaders about the future of Greenland today. But what about the Greenlanders themselves? A former member of their government will be with me in a few minutes' time, but it's now 6:29, nearly 6:30, and Amelia Cox has the news headlines.
A former security advisor to Donald Trump has told LBC she believes a deal can be done between the US and Denmark over Greenland. Speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr, Victoria Coates says it would be good for NATO to concentrate on the war in Ukraine. The Technology Secretary says X must urgently deal with its AI chatbot, which is being used to create fake sexualised images. Ofcom is already investigating Elon Musk's social media platform over the concerns around Grok. And high winds from Storm Goretti are due to bring heavy snow to large parts of England and Wales. A yellow weather warning for snow will come into force at 6 p.m. on Thursday. LBC weather: snow will linger in northern Scotland tonight, rain moving west across Wales and England with showers for Northern Ireland, lows of -3 degrees.
On the latest episode of The Newsagents,
we discuss the continuing threats from the Trump White House towards Greenland. Is this the end of the NATO alliance? And if so, what does it mean for us?
Get the latest episode of The Newsagents with Emily Maitlis, John Sopel and Lewis Goodall. Listen or watch on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app.
Yeah.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:32. Now, not all the news is bad news. Next year, England gets the new online NHS service, and today we learned that it'll focus first on the menopause, prostate problems and eye conditions. The idea is to carry out 8.5 million appointments in the first 3 years. To explain more, I'm joined now by the Health Innovation Minister, Dr. Zubir Ahmed, who is, apart from being an MP, a surgeon himself.
Evening, Andrew. Nice to be here.
Very nice to have you on the show. First question, an obvious question, I guess, is you've chosen three things: prostate, eye conditions, and the menopause. Why those?
Well, thanks, Andrew. I mean, we've actually chosen 4 specialties and nine conditions for the new NHS online hospital.
That's too many for me to read out.
I know, but you better just make sure I know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to just quickly list the 4 specialties. So it's gastroenterology, which includes things like diagnosing inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease. There's eye conditions, as you said, things like glaucoma, macular degeneration, cataracts. There's urology, things like prostate issues. And then there's gynecology, which is endometriosis and menopausal conditions. Over 500,000 women are waiting on those waiting lists at the moment.
Are these things that are regarded as serious but perhaps underdiagnosed and too slowly treated at the moment?
These are things that are regarded as being having high numbers of people waiting and being amenable to an online option. And I think the option is the key word. What we're proposing with the NHS online hospital, when we're thinking about these 4 specialties, is an additional layer an option to patients over and above what they have already. And so it means that if you've got capacity in one part of the country and high demand in another, we can marry that capacity and demand in a way that's never been possible in the history of the NHS up until now. And so we have a real prospect, therefore, in these conditions, to end that postcode lottery of access to care.
Now, this is an online part of the NHS of a kind we haven't seen before, so it's quite hard to get our heads around this. So if I'm a patient, shall we say, with a prostate problem, whatever it might be, in a year's time, what will I notice that's different?
What you'll notice that's different, hopefully, is that you've got an additional option where you can access that consultation, that assessment, that answer at a time that's convenient to you, in a place that's convenient to you. That might possibly be your own living room.
And I'll do that through an app.
You will do that through your NHS app, which will coordinate with the online hospital.
And would that put me in touch with somebody who knew what they were talking about?
It certainly would. All of the cases will be assessed by specialist consultants in that area. They'll provide an opinion. If that opinion requires you to have more tests, they will organise those tests. If they require more information, they can even organise an online consultation for you.
It sounds great, but the final blindingly obvious question is, where does the money come from?
So this online hospital, because it's additive, it's going to be generating 8.5 million new appointments over 3 years, 4 times than your local NHS trust can cope with, comes with £100 million funding envelope attached to it. So it's fully funded, and it's, like I say, it's an additional service that in many places I find when I talk to patients, my own patients, their kind of idea of what's available online far exceeds what's already there. So in many ways, we're simply catching up with patient expectation.
It sounds like a lot of money, but is 100 million enough?
It's enough to get the service up and running and the architecture up and running, and to access the additional consultant hours that will be needed to make sure those diagnoses, those opinions, those tests, those treatments can be acted upon. And I think this is the really crucial point, actually, Andrew. As much as it might be convenient, and it will be convenient for patients, it will also introduce a more flexible working environment for consultants and clinicians. And I can tell you, as someone on the front line, I never get tired of seeing more patients, doing more operations. What tires me is the administrative load, the bureaucratic burden, and this was going to change the equation in terms of work satisfaction as well for clinicians.
Well, as I said at the start of the conversation, it sounds like good news to me. Thank you very much, indeed, Minister, for coming in and explaining it more. And back now to our top story and the thorny issue of Greenland, with European leaders warning against a Trump takeover of the Danish territory. Well, let's hear now from someone who spent a long time as a senior politician in Greenland, Vittus Qujaukitsoq, the former Minister of Industry, Trade and Foreign Affairs Minister. Thank you very much, former Minister. Thank you very much indeed for joining us again. We've just heard a suggestion on the programme from a Trump advisor that in the end, money will sort this out, that the people of Greenland can be, in effect, and I'm sorry to use the word, bribed to accept American hegemony. What's your view?
I think we need to look at things in terms of the security aspect. You have to mind that United States had been stationed in Greenland for over 85 years, safeguarding Greenland and the Arctic in general. So we've had coexistence with the United States for 85 years. And I think our importance will continue for many decades to come, regardless of what status Greenland has. So we have to accept the fact that Greenland is important geopolitically, but because of our position in the Arctic.
Yes. It sounds to me that, I know that you've had a sometimes tense relationship with the Kingdom of Denmark, but it's, if you woke up one morning and suddenly discovered that you were an American, not a Dane, how would you feel about that?
We've been guarded by United States for 85 years, so it's not new for us to have Americans stationed in Greenland militarily. And it's no coincidence that they are the ones being stationed in Greenland. And I think it's because of their military might, but also due to the fact that Greenland is very important due to our mineral resources and many other business possibilities. So
yes, I was going to ask you about that, actually, because, I mean, you're sounding very pragmatic about an American takeover. But one of the things we know that Donald Trump wants and is interested in is the rare earth minerals, and they're scattered right around the perimeter of Greenland, certainly. And there are also big oil deposits around Greenland. Now, up to now, there's been a moratorium on that kind of development because people have been too worried about, the pristine wilderness and the wildlife and the sort of environmental impact of that. If that changed, would that be a problem for Greenland?
First of all, let me state that Greenland is striving for independence. That's important to emphasize. Secondly, I think Greenland has aspiration to become economically independent and become independent nation itself because of the riches and the resources we have available in Greenland. For that, we've been working toward independence for the past 47 years, and we continue to strive our struggle despite having the coexistence with Denmark. And I think we have to mind that the interference of the United States have interrupted this work toward independence.
This path. Well, listen,
we are being assimilated more and more to Europe and Denmark because of that.
Yes. Well, listen, very good luck with that. I don't think that's necessarily what was on the table or in Donald Trump's mind, but very good. Best of luck with that. And thank you so much for talking to me tonight. Now then, Trump has spoken this afternoon about the, quotes, amazing and brilliant US operation in Venezuela. But what are the real consequences? There have been pro-Maduro protests in Caracas this afternoon. Can the US really say they've actually solved the problems facing the Venezuelan people? Well, Professor Grace Livingston, affiliated lecturer at the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Cambridge, joins me now. Professor, thank you very much for talking to us tonight. We've seen already quite an angry reaction on the streets of Venezuela about what happened to Maduro, and a sense that Venezuela has been humiliated by the United States. But is there, behind that, quiet acceptance or enthusiasm for a change of regime, do you think?
Well, I think there's, as you say, there's a lot of anger about the way in which the head of state was removed. It was the United States bombed a sovereign state and effectively kidnapped the president, violating international law. So there's, as you say, humiliation, anger, even amongst people who disliked Nicolas Maduro, the president. There's a certain feeling of that's not the way to behave. But primarily, I think there's a feeling of fear and trepidation about what's going to happen next, because what's interesting is that the United States, spent a long time in the run-up to this complaining about the lack of democracy in Venezuela, claiming that the whole government was running a drugs trafficking cartel, and now it's all about oil. Almost all Donald Trump talks about is oil. And when he was asked whether there were going to be elections in Venezuela, he said, no, we have to fix the country first. We're going to let the oil companies in. And the very regime that they've been complaining about is still in power, which is one thing that worries a lot of Venezuelans.
Well, that's what worries me as well. And the bizarre thought that the official opposition leader who won the Nobel Prize has been excluded by Donald Trump because he's jealous of that, sort of hangs over this. In other words, is there a real opportunity of a more moderate, democratically supported government coming in, or is this going to be yet another turn of the screw? We've got the Venezuelan military still on the streets tonight, for instance.
Well, I mean, I think the military is actually key to this. I mean, the United States has actually intervened in many South American countries in the past, but normally in association with the military, it supported military coups. But what's happened here is the Venezuelan military has stayed loyal to the incumbent regime, And I think the United States has taken a very pragmatic approach. This isn't Panama. The United States invaded Panama in 1989, but Venezuela is 12 times the size of Panama. It's got an enormous army. It's got many armed civilians. It's on the border with Colombia with many armed groups. So it could be very, very messy. So they've taken a pragmatic approach. They can see that the Venezuelan opposition doesn't have the support of the military. So they're going to work with the incumbent government. But when I say work with, what they're talking about is coercing it. In the words of the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, he says we're going to coerce the new government to do what we want. And Donald Trump says we're going to pay a very big price. They'll pay a very big price if they don't do what we want. And part of that coercion, of course, is the sanctions and the naval blockade on oil going outside, leaving Venezuela, oil exports, which is causing an incredible economic crisis within Venezuela. You know, if we're talking about what real people are really suffering, there's food shortages, the price of food is very, very high. People are finding it really hard to survive. And because of this naval blockade, you know, the economy is on the point of collapse. Yeah. And this is really the sort of coercion that the Trump administration wants to put on this new regime.
And what? So I'm sorry to jump in, but I'm wondering what can you tell us about the new president for the time being, the former deputy president? She comes from a revolutionary family. She has been entirely in the Chavez tradition. You know, there's no sign that she is in any sense a moderate or somebody who would naturally want to go along with Donald Trump.
Well, as you say, she comes from a left-wing family. Her father was a rebel. He was killed in police custody, you know, quite a famous case in Venezuela. You know, she's been a firm Chavista, but she's, you know, quite an astute political operator. She's a lawyer. And she is pragmatic. She was in charge of the oil industry. She was the oil minister. She's had negotiations with Trump's envoy and with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and with various private sector, you know, oil companies. So she knows about the economy and what the economy needs. So I think they think that she may be a person they can work with. I mean, she sent mixed signals. On the one hand, she said, you know, we don't want to be a colony, but she's also taken a slightly more conciliatory approach, saying, you know, we're willing to work with the United States on a respectful basis.
Well, they certainly need somebody who's going to be pliable. Professor Livingston, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. That was Grace Livingston there, the author of America's Backyard, A History of American Interventions in Latin America. Now, up next, we often hear that democracy is under threat, and it appears there are many young people who might actually want it to be under threat. Why would that be? We'll talk about that next, but the time now, 6:46.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
At 9, has the world taken its eye off Iran? At 8, cross question, but first, are the comments on Greenland issued by the UK and the EU robust enough?
Ian Dale at 7. Listen on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app. Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:48. Now, European leaders have just got up to speak in Paris after their Coalition of the Willing summit. Here is the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, speaking now.
First, that we will participate in US-led monitoring and verification of any ceasefire. Second, we will support the long-time provision of armaments for Ukraine's defence. And third, we will work towards binding commitments to support Ukraine in the case for a future armed attack by Russia. This is all about building the practical foundations on which peace would rest. But we can only get to a peace deal if Putin is ready to make compromises. And so we have to be frank. For all Russia's words, Putin is not showing that he's ready for peace. Over the last few weeks, we've seen the opposite. Further horrific strikes on Ukraine, killing and wounding civilians, and cutting off power for millions of people in the dead of winter. His forces hit a hospital in Kyiv just yesterday. And he's tried to distract from peace efforts with unfounded claims of attacks on his residents. Now, this only hardens our resolve. We will continue to step out our support for Ukraine's defence in 2026 to ensure it gets the equipment and backing it needs to continue the fight. And we will keep the pressure up on Russia.
Very interesting there. What we've learned is that Britain and France have agreed to establish what they call military hubs inside Ukraine, and you can really feel that Keir Starmer's main focus, as so often, is on the Ukraine war and nothing else, whatever the huge noise is off. Now, I'm joined by somebody who can talk about the future. It's the beginning of the year, pretty much still a time to take the temperature. Well, we know what the temperature is like outside. I don't mean in that sense. I mean in terms of the national mood, what Keir Starmer is also thinking about when he gets back home. And so, Craig Oliver, you were, in a sense, David Cameron's right-hand man for many years in Number 10, and you now produce this annual Global Radar report when you talk to lots of decision makers and you do polls around the world, around the Western world.
Yes.
And you produce this report, 2026, A Rewired World. And I have to say, Craig, it's not very cheerful reading.
It's not very cheerful reading. You're right. We spoke to 175 leaders in business, politics, media. Spoke to you. You contributed to it. Thank you very much.
I did, yes.
We also did 20,000 people in polling around the world. And we spoke UK, US, Canada, the entirety of the EU and Japan. So very developed Western economies. And what we discovered very, very clearly is that there's actually quite a mood of pessimism across that developed Western economy world. And that, you know, some of the statistics are extraordinary. 73% of people believe life will be harder for the next generation. My country feels divided. 80% of people in the UK, that kind of thing.
And it's not just us, is it? I mean, the Americans are worried about exactly the same kind of things as we are. Cost of living and is right at the top of that. Immigration comes very high up. And the Germans and the Japanese, everybody seems to be worried about the same sorts of things.
Yeah, cost of living, I think, is a huge issue for people. And in most countries, there is not a belief that anybody's going to be able to do anything much about it. I think there's also a deep, deep concern about whether or not governments can actually do anything. I was surprised, actually, talking to a lot of people who are in the kind of establishment elite, not necessarily friends of Donald Trump, but we're actually like, we don't like what he's doing with institutions. We don't like a lot of the stuff that he's doing around the world. But at least he's showing that governments can get things done. And in the rest of the world, there's a very sort of gloomy view of governments. Can they actually change anything? Are they able to actually achieve anything? And I think that that's putting quite a lot of pressure on liberal democracies.
Does that suggest that people who would think of themselves as essentially moderate, a bit centrist, if they want to survive, they're now in a world where they have to move fast and break things?
That definitely is a mood among a lot of people. We talk a lot about the K-shaped economy, which basically means there's a certain group of people who are doing incredibly well and most other people not, and it's like the legs of a K-shaped graph. I think we're also in a kind of K-shaped world in terms of opinion. The elite had some very, very strong views on the kind of thing that needs to be done. They think AI should be allowed to flourish, that we should cut spending, there should be tax incentives for entrepreneurs. The public across the world are diametrically opposed to all of that kind of thing. And that sense
they want
of
wealth taxes.
Yes, 64% of people around the world think that there should be a wealth tax, that we shouldn't just be taxing labour, that property and assets should also be taxed too. And there is that sort of sense of that being would have been rejected out of hand, but actually clearly feeling in the ether something that is an issue that is rising and rising.
Are there any glimpse of light or hope or, a better future in any of this for, leaders and others who are going to read their way through the report?
A lot of people do actually focus on AI. There is concern among the publics, is it, going to decimate jobs, that kind of thing. But I think a lot of people who know about it think that it could be the solution to growth around the world, that they think there's a lot of optimism in terms of medicine and the opportunity to make the world a better place. So that was the sort of one area where people felt optimistic. For the most part, though, I think people felt that we'd had this 80 years of a kind of settlement around the world where we had strong institutions, people protecting the rule of law, democracy, feeling that there should be some kind of working together. And actually, I think a lot of people feeling this week, indeed, that has been shaken to its core.
I was going to say, in strong institutions, it does not feel that way tonight.
It doesn't.
Sir Craig Oliver, thank you very, very much indeed for coming in and not entirely cheering me up, but thanks anyway. Now let's get to more on that press conference in Paris among European leaders, because there's some pretty big news about possible boots on the ground. Our correspondent Aggie Chambre has the latest. Aggie.
Indeed, Andrew, that's right. So the UK and France have signed a formal declaration of intent in the event of peace to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. They would operate on Ukrainian soil, securing Ukraine's skies and seas and building an armed forces fit for the future. So at the moment, it is just UK and France. But in the statement from the Coalition of the Willing, which of course includes far more countries, there is talk of a multinational force for Ukraine made up from contributions of willing nations.
That, of course, that is exactly what Vladimir Putin has said he will never accept. And Craig, since you're here, does that not put us into the danger of some kind of stumbling confrontation with the Russians when we don't want to?
I think that's right. And I think what's also happened this week is a lot of people feel that actually what happened in Venezuela, the talk about Greenland and Cuba, that kind of thing has actually emboldened Putin. So is he likely to say, actually, I tell you what, I am going to sue for peace, and that's perfectly okay. The French and the British can go into Ukraine. I'll be perfectly happy about that. Seems to me that that's a very unlikely scenario.
And just listening to a little bit of Keir Starmer earlier on, Aggie, I know he is somebody who's entirely comfortable with his extremely steely. I mean, if we thought Boris Johnson was hard-nosed on Ukraine, Keir Starmer is even more so.
Indeed. And, he said when he was responding in that press conference after Volodymyr Zelensky and Emmanuel Macron that he believes that we are closer to our goal than ever. And he said he is there in Paris to keep driving that effort forward. But I think, as you say, this is sort of unexpectedly comfortable ground for him. And actually, he's actually much more comfortable on an international front than a domestic front in many ways. And I think that is why he had, in some ways, the reaction to Venezuela that he did have, because he felt that Ukraine, security guarantees, Ukraine were very close.
Absolutely prime thing.
And that was the key. And that's why he sort of was not more hardline on the response to Venezuela.
Craig, you've sat in number 10 when decisions have to be taken about what you actually say to an America that you're not entirely happy with. Do you have some sympathy for the sort of mealy-mouthed, slightly kind of euphemistic way that Keir Starmer dealt with the Venezuelan crisis?
I can understand why he's doing that. I mean, look, basically, you don't want to get in the line of sight of the US president who is capable of doing some pretty radical things. I don't think it's a very happy situation to be in, but I think most responsible prime ministers would probably behave in exactly the same way that Keir Starmer is. Very interesting, though, that him being very strong on Greenland, though, that is a real marker in the sand.
That is a marker in the sand, though. It was fascinating hearing Victoria Coates earlier on, who is a Trump advisor and very close to Trump, saying that actually, in the end, a deal will be struck. That, whether they pay money or whatever, the Americans will move in, the Greenlanders will accept it, and it'll be a done deal.
I mean, look, that's perfectly possible scenario. I mean, there are very, very few. There's tens of thousands of people living in the country. They don't have a huge army. They're not in a position particularly to protect.
They've got one hunting rifle and a fishing rod.
Well, exactly. So, I mean, it's a very difficult circumstance for them, and there will be real pressure. I do think that the international situation would change. I do think that Europe would have a lot to say if that was the case. And it's not going to be as easy, I think, as the Venezuela situation for him. But that doesn't mean to say he's not going to try.
Aggie, what chance do you think that this summit in Paris steals the headlines back from Donald Trump for a while?
I think it's highly possible. I would imagine that they also spent some time talking about Venezuela as well. And actually, I think it's worth noting, I still don't think the Prime Minister's actually spoken to Donald Trump on the phone since Saturday, when, of course, that event happened in Venezuela. The kidnapping happened in Venezuela. And it was expected that after this summit, perhaps they would then finally have that conversation. But I think this is a pretty big deal. I think we can expect this to take the headlines. And I think on the Greenland point, it does show actually that there is great concern among European leaders, and the fact that they are willing to basically put out that pretty punchy, for them, statement earlier today on that proves that they are pretty worried.
Well, what a day, what a night it has been. So Craig Oliver, Aggie, Chambre, thank you both very much. I'm out of time, but I will be back with you tomorrow. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion. You can put your news categories in the order you'd like them. You can pause, you can rewind live radio, and you can listen to a range of podcasts. Download the all-new official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Henry Riley. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew.
For the region, obviously Greenland should be part of the United States.
European leaders have met in Paris this afternoon, ostensibly to finalise arrangements for the coalition of the willing in Ukraine. But it's been overshadowed by the Trump takeover of Venezuela and his threat